Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Navigating the Arctic Insights with Ambassador Mike Sfraga. I'm Siobhan Choi, President and CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council, and I'm so glad that you've joined us online for today's conversation. It's a balmy negative 15 degrees here in Anchorage, and I think negative 32 in Fairbanks, where Mike is calling in from, which feels like a very on-brand Arctic backdrop for this discussion. Today's conversation is part of our Evangeline Atwood Distinguished Speakers Series, named in honor of our founder, the late Evangeline Atwood, and made possible through the generous support of the Atwood Foundation. I'd also like to thank the University of Alaska Fairbanks and ConocoPhillips for their continued and generous support of the Alaska World Affairs Council. It's an honor to welcome today's speaker, Ambassador Mike Sfraga, Interim Chancellor of the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a leading voice in Arctic affairs with nearly 4 decades of experience. You can find his full bio on our website, but I do want to hand it over and get things started with Ambassador Sfraga.
You all, I'm sure there are many of my friends and colleagues out there tuning in. I want to say hello to them and thank you to the Alaska World Affairs Council for the invitation. Indeed, we have what I think is a wonderful and burgeoning relationship. I think this is good for both organizations, but also good for the state, and we will continue to support dialogues like this. Really appreciated being a part of the effort with Ambassador Bill Taylor. I thought that was a wonderful partnership, but also I think it brought to Alaska, not only a leading expert, but a perspective that sometimes we don't get because we don't have the exposure to experts that the World Affairs Council now is able to bring to us. I want to thank you all for that. Again, I know I have many friends online. You know that I speak a lot about the issues that I will cover today. So none of this is meant to assume that some of you don't know this or more that what you will see. So I hope that this provides a framework for discussion. But I do have about 25 slides or so. Some of you have seen these before, but in light of recent headlines and activities and realities, some of the frameworks I'm going to share with you today have brought out not just the further importance of the Arctic, but maybe in a different context, the importance of thinking about the Arctic in very different ways. So, let's see if we can't advance the first slide. Let's see how we can do this.
Mike, if you just hit the arrow on your computer, it should advance for you.
Share setting.
I think just on your keyboard, if you just hit the right arrow, it should.
Got it.
There you go.
Can you see that? So you should be seeing a map. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, this is the map that I use often to just give folks an idea of where we are. Even to us Alaskans, sometimes we forget that the Arctic is a big neighborhood, but a small community. Again, many colleagues probably online, and you know this, but I've argued from this map over the last, I think it's been in existence for 10 years, 12 years, that this portrays the Arctic in a very unique way, but also the evolution of the Arctic and its importance to the globe over time. And in particular, Alaska's position. We all talk about it, but I think now more than ever, we can say without being measured that Alaska does sit at the nexus of U.S. domestic and foreign policy. It does. Any narrative in the press, any statements by our or other administrations, any reality on security writ large, the wider aperture definition of security, any of those things. Many of us online can draw a direct line to the north, to our state, and then from our state and the north to the rest of the globe. If you talk about Venezuela and Greenland, you best talk about Alaska in that context and the United States, whether it's oil prices, security, the way in which our foreign policy develops, other foreign policy develops. To me, this map demonstrates, yes, it's a focused top-down look at the north, but look at the arcs that go out from it. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But really key for me and maybe for us as Alaskans, and maybe others from the country weighing in, this idea of Alaska as the center, the nexus of domestic and U.S. foreign policy still resonates, at least with me. It certainly did in my previous position, where my job was to infuse U.S. Arctic policy into U.S. foreign policy. And we're seeing that play out today. It also was unique because it infused U.S. Arctic policy into domestic policy because of our state. So again, big neighborhood, small community, incredibly dynamic, and more important now that I think than ever. Uh, I will not go through each one of these issues because the page on the left-hand side it goes far longer in terms of issues, but I just want to I just want it to resonate with all of us that no matter what issue you bring up, I likely or we likely, as Northerners or those that are thinking about the North, can make a direct tie, whether it's great power competition or the importance of the transatlantic alliance and the idea of a trans-Arctic alliance, which I'll talk about in a moment. But again, how key the North is to the rest of the globe and how central our state or the Alaska is to the North and how key the North American Arctic is to the rest of the world. As many of you know, I spent time in DC trying to explain the importance of the Arctic. I think it wasn't because of me or anyone else. And if you have to give a lot of credit, give credit to Senator Murkowski for pushing the Arctic rock up the hill, and Senator Sullivan and now Senator Begich, kind of highlighting the importance of the North, the importance of our state. But this idea of navigating the Arctic's 7 seas came to me because I had members of Congress, after testifying or meeting with them, saying to me, Mike, we understand the importance of Alaska and the Arctic. We get it. But you really got to boil it down for us. You really got to give me the elevator pitch, because I have constituencies that I need to respond to. I need to demonstrate in Congress or elsewhere that the Arctic is important. Why? Why is it important? That made me think about this idea. Now, look, there's 10 drivers, there's 15 drivers. I picked 7. To me, there are 7 key drivers of change, influencing drivers to our north. And I think they remain the same. I think these are still viable today as they were when I made these up about 10 years ago, to respond to tell me what the key drivers are and tell me what the connections are between them and tell me why I should care here in the middle of the United States and not up in the north. I won't go through in detail each of these boxes, but I do want to highlight them. So I talk about navigating the Arctic's 7 seas. To Mike, the 7 key drivers of change or issues that we're all going to have to grapple with. And how we navigate these 7, in my opinion, and how we influence and inform and work these, in my opinion, this will determine the future Arctic. I think this still remains. These are big boxes. It's not, constrained, but obviously climate is the number one on my wheel of drivers. I don't think you can get away with this. I don't think you can argue whether it's real or not. I think it's real. I think it's rapid, and I think it's relentless. Our military knew this decades ago because they were planning for it. They understood their domain was changing. My Lord, we feel this here in our own state with 2 typhoons that devastated dozens and dozens of our communities in just 3 or 4 years. We're seeing the changes. It's best that we understand them and react to them, and understand what mitigation is and understand what adaptation is and how the North is changing and how that's driving global change, environmental change all over the world. The second to me is commodities, which has now, it was an issue, it's even more of an issue today. Whether it's fisheries or LNG or oil, or critical and rare earths, I would argue that commodities it will continue to drive change in the North. When I said this 10 years ago, people had a big question mark at the end of it. I'm not sure that question mark remains, or maybe it's a little bit smaller now, but it's very clear that in the North American Arctic, Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and elsewhere, Sweden, Norway, Finland, the idea of commodities, whether it's critical or rare earths or whatever, that's a key driver. We do not want one nation to have complete control over supply chain, and development. You just don't. You want to diversify that. You could also think about commodities and the connection to commerce. When we're thinking about the Northern Sea Route, we're thinking about Yamal Peninsula and shipping of LNG down the Bering Strait, I would call it the strategic Bering Strait, into markets in China and elsewhere. You can talk about shadow fleets. So commodities, commerce, the need for venture capital to come north to invest in our Arctic is essential. whether it's the American Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, wherever, I think it's essential. So to me, commerce has and will continue to shape the North going forward. Connectivity is another one. Again, each of these I could spend an hour on. I will not. Each of these, I just want us to be thinking differently. It's how I think about the Arctic. Connectivity. Yes, we want affordable, reliable, redundant internet connectivity. We want that for all of our communities. We want that for our national security, our homeland security. Absolutely. But I'm also thinking about connectivity in a different way. Roads, ports, rails, people to people, international organizations. How are we connected in the North? What are our challenges? Lack of roads, lack of capacity, lack of energy. What do we need to do to address those kind of challenges in the North? That is a driver of change and an issue for the North. Communities. What about our communities? Wonderful, adaptable, vibrant, sustainable communities, but they're under pressure. Absolutely. And so what does it mean to have a typhoon hit your community, but also just you don't have a road system, you don't have affordable energy? The communities and how they are influenced and how they influence the New North, to me, is another driver of change. Cooperation. We have seen it ebb and flow. I would argue that the Arctic Council is as important today as it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Obviously, with Russia's war on Ukraine, that has pressured the cooperation that we all celebrated in the North. Now we have a very different dynamic, not just in the Arctic Council, but cooperation overall. I would argue that it's time to double down on our cooperation in the North, whether it's research or economics or politics or energy security, you name it. But cooperation or lack thereof, the need for more, will be a driver of change. And finally, competition. When I made this, we had competition in the North, but it wasn't as it is today. I think that sea now is a capital C with a bold around it. And I think we are seeing the great power competition play out, certainly on our side of the Bering Strait, but also in the Barents, and also in our own foreign policy and geopolitics, the competition. Many of you know, so I won't insult you and go into detail, but many of you know that Russia has been more active, China certainly more active, at least on the Alaska side of the Arctic and the Bering, and then Russia and China together on the Bering and in the Aleutians and in the North Pacific together. This is a very, very different dynamic in terms of cooperation. Everything from bear bombers and Chinese bombers off the coast of Alaska to shared armadas off the coast of Alaska in the Bering to FSB and Chinese Coast Guard research vessels, multiple Chinese research vessels, quote unquote research vessels off the coast of Alaska this past summer. So the competition has become not just elevated, the pace, the rapidity, but also the sophistication and the cooperation between Russia and China is something that we should be concerned about, and part of a clear driver of change, not just on the Bering, but also in the North Atlantic, Greenland, Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, certainly in the GI-UK gap as well. So that is the first conceptual framework. I've got a couple more I'll go through quickly, but that's just to frame how I think about the Arctic. The next slide is something I've used multiple times, including at the Munich Security Conference, where I'm thinking about these arcs of the Arctic and how the Arctic is connected. And to me, there's a North American, European arc of the Arctic. I talk about the world of commonality, the cooperation between the Arctic 7 nations, the stretch from Eastern NATO to Western NATO, the US, NORAD, NORTHCOM, and then what that means for a transatlantic, trans-Arctic alliance, the people of the North and how the connections are there. It's just, again, a different way of thinking, certainly as we are entering a new phase in this new Arctic, and a new phase in not just US foreign policy, but broader foreign policy for nations in the Arctic, but also nations outside of the Arctic. Again, just another framework, a geographer's view of the North in a shifting North. Obviously, the Russian Federation is an arc in and of itself. I left Kaliningrad in there because I think the Baltic obviously is a particularly interesting and important region. But the Baltic also is absolutely connected to the Arctic, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But we should take note that we have these arcs and how these arcs of influence and arcs of interests play out each and every day. This is not it's an arc, but it's an arcish. But the Atlantic arc, we forget that there is a lot of activity happening on the Atlantic side of the Arctic, uh, being here on the western side of the Arctic. But again, there's a connection between the South Atlantic, North Atlantic, and then into the GIUK gap and into the Barents. And it's not just about national security and homeland security, although absolutely, those are number one imperatives and things we should be thinking about. But I also think about the changes happening to the Greenland ice cap, the melt of that water into the system, its impact on the Atlantic and the Gulf Stream. I mean, it's all connected. The need for more Coast Guard cooperation, the need for more surveillance on shadow fleets. These things all, they don't just radiate from the North. The North is impacted about what's happening elsewhere. And if nothing else highlights that, just in the recent days, an oil tanker being seized by the United States as part of a shadow fleet headed north. I mean, that shows us that it is now, fortunately and sometimes unfortunately, a global Arctic. This is the last of the four arcs. Obviously, it's more like a Pacific blob, but this is how I view the connection between the Arctic, Alaska, Russia, North Korea, China, Singapore, Japan, Korea, all with interests, all with interests in the North, the Arctic, for a number of reasons, but how things play out, how concerns and interests in the Malacca Straits might spur some nations to look at the Northern Sea Route a bit differently, how fisheries migrate or don't, how activities of different naval fleets may originate in the South Pacific, but somehow find their way north to the Aleutians, and what that means for our own homeland security, but also to our Asian allies and partners as well. And there are countries here, Japan, Korea, Singapore, that have real equities. They've invested a lot of money in Arctic research. Again, just tying Alaska and the Arctic to this broader geopolitical, economic, environmental, social, cultural, defense structure and evolution that we're seeing each day more and more. I want to just check in. Siobhan, are we okay? Are we good on time? Is this on task?
Absolutely. We are on time.
Okay.
If Lisa's there to adjust the size of the screen so we can see the slides a little bit better.
Oh, all right. I'm going to see if we can't get her. We'll just do this in real time. Hang on. Actually, she just walked in, so we are doing it in real time. So if you all hang on with me, this is the lovely part of just talking with friends. We're just going to be formally informal. Can we make that larger?
Let me see what I can do for you.
And we can make these available and can post these on the site if that's helpful down the road.
This works great. Thank you.
Okay, is that good? That's better?
Perfect.
Perfect. Well, perfect. Can't get better than that. All right. Thank you, Lisa.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to come back here. Let's go to this one very quickly. And look, folks, chat with me. And if somebody's like, Mike, we really don't want you to talk about that. We want you to talk about X. I'll go there, but I just want to lay the groundwork here, and then I have a few other slides. I don't want to PowerPoint you to death. But again, another framework I came up when working with my colleagues in Munich, and that's trying to think about the North in another different way. And that is, look, are there 5 Bs of an interconnected Arctic? I don't know. But to me, it kind of works. And it works because it just stretches the way we think about the North. I don't want to be thought about the Arctic as that remote place where Mary Shelley had situated Frankenstein. I don't want to be that, nor do I want to be on a weather map off the coast of California with Hawaii. We're not that anymore. This is really a global dynamic Arctic. Yes, there's a lot of security concerns, and they are legitimate. There are legitimate concerns with China, with Russia. I would argue North Korea and missile systems. There's a lot going on here, but it is connected to almost every other global foreign policy issue that we face as a United States, but I would argue at least 7 of the 8 Arctic nations. So I won't insult you by going through all this, but I see these connections. I see these connections with the Bering Sea. And again, pick your issue: national security, energy security, economics, fisheries, culture, social, whatever. There's a connection with the Bering to the Beaufort, whether that's thinking about energy, the people, climate, but the Bering and the Beaufort are obviously connected, and we can talk about security and we could talk about UNCLOS and other matters. These are connected. It's just a different way of thinking. I would connect the Barents, different political dynamics going on here, different relationships on our side of the Bering, China, Russia, very active. On the Barents, it's a very different world. There's a very different dynamic with our colleagues in Norway, Sweden, Finland, with Russia. Very different dynamic with Svalbard. Different dynamic with cable systems being tampered with. But these are issues that the North is seeing across the Bs. I'd add to that the Baltic, and the war on Ukraine has shown us that even though we have some questions as to how communication lines and power lines and pipelines have been disrupted, tampered with, we have a pretty good feel as to what might be happening. But the Baltic is inherently tied to the Arctic, and with Sweden and Finland joining NATO and having NATO members around the Baltic region that also have Arctic equities, you can't pull these apart. And with activity between the Baltic and the Arctic, the Russian Arctic and the Russian Arctic to the Baltic as part of what's happening in Ukraine, you simply have to, at least in Mike's mind, you have to connect the two. It doesn't have to be one for one. I think we need to be mindful. And then finally, in the Black Sea, again, the connection with these other areas that might have been disassociated with the Arctic, I don't think you can do that anymore. I think you have to think about the North in a very different way, north-south and east-west. That's the last of the frameworks. I'm quickly going to go through some other things as well, because I'm hoping that this is all primer for a real discussion. There is an existing U.S. national strategy for the Arctic region. I know this administration is refining it. There'll be a focus on security, of course, but I think these are still legitimate pillars, whether they are sustained in the degree to which the administration pushes on one and maybe not on the other. To me, we'll see how this all works out, and we'll all work with whatever unfolds. But I still think these four pillars, whether they're in a national security strategy or not, a U.S. for the Arctic or not, they still are inherently useful and still at play, no matter what you may think politically or otherwise. I still think they are pillars for the Arctic region. And we know that there have been many strategies over the years. Curiously, there have been a lot of consistencies. No matter which U.S. administration has been in charge, there have been a lot of consistencies, but priorities have shifted. So, and then of course our services have a lot of their strategies, and we're seeing almost daily the North coming up in a lot of different contexts for a lot of the U.S. federal agencies, but also for our friends and allies in the North. But again, curiously, or perhaps not curiously, outside of the North as well. I have let me know. Can you still see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Diane. Thank you. I knew I had friends online. Okay. My screen shifted, so I'm looking at a different screen now. But what you're seeing is just rehashing again why I think Alaska sits at this nexus of domestic and U.S. foreign policy. I show this to a lot of audiences. All I would say here is we know there's dramatic change happening. The extent of our sea ice has gone down by about 50%. The volume is down by the thickness is down by about 50%, and the overall ice pack has been reduced by 75%. All things that we should be mindful of and concerned about. There are some opportunities that folks would like to see happen. There are also some significant environmental issues here that we need to be mindful of as well. I would just point out that even though this is Merbach, we all know what happened this past September, but think about this. Over the last 3-4 years, we've had these huge typhoons because of the changing climate and the impact on our communities in our state, but it's happening in the North and elsewhere in the world as well. We need to be mindful of that. This slide is not because I don't like the people of Scotland, I do, but I gave a talk there a few years ago, and I tried to give them an idea of not just the scale and scope of Alaska and the Arctic, but also the size of the storms that we are seeing and unfortunately may be seeing into the future. And then I was able to talk about the need for research, the need for supporting our communities, the need for new building codes for a thawing permafrost environment, a changing environment, and also the scale that our military needs to think about in terms of the environments that they will be dealing with. These are not the environments of 20, 30 years ago. The domain is changing across a broad spectrum of issues. Then I put this in here because I talk about the need for a deep water port in Nome. I talk about the need to expand our port in Seward, the Seward port that the RV Sekuliak gets docked to. That is a 12-month ice-free port. I think our country would do well to invest to expand that port and continue with Nome. I think it's really expensive to build things. I have testified to say, think about it. Again, just one of my bumper stickers here, but think about it as Arctic Legos. If we're going to build a port in Nome or expand the port in Seward, or really importantly, build out the port in Adak, I do think Senator Sullivan is right on thinking about our national security, our homeland security, our economic security by taking that asset and building it out. It's a lot of money. I get it. But this new world demands that at least in Mike's opinion, that it demands that we take a look at what infrastructure we have. And if we're going to build infrastructure, leverage that and build these Arctic Legos, build on what we have together. So if we have a port in Seward, you should be thinking about this 12-month ice-free port. You should be thinking about the fact that it has rail, road, and air access. That's good for the Sekuliak. It's good for more research, but it's also good for our Coast Guard, our Navy, our national security. I think the same with Nome. If we can build Nome out so that we can have eyes on what's happening in the Bering more than we have today, and support for search and rescue for our Coast Guard, put a white hole up there. Maybe we need gray holes in the Bering. That's fine. And then support with ADAC. All I'm saying here is that I think this goes back to connectivity. I think the state of Alaska is at the tip of the spear for the Arctic, whether it's economic, whether it's search and rescue, whether it's making sure our fisheries are secure and robust. And now we see the activity in the North Pacific coming from the South Pacific, and we see this rapid, more increased work and activity between Russia and China in this region. I think it behooves the United States to understand how important the U.S. is, Alaska is to the United States economically and otherwise. I just remind folks again, big neighborhood, small community, incredibly dynamic, and we're blessed with great allies. If we have a trans-Arctic alliance, does it exist? In Mike's mind, it does. I talk about it all the time. The US through Alaska, Canada, Greenland through the Kingdom, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. These 7 nations, in Mike's mind, form a trans-Arctic alliance. Yes, for our collective security, for the US's own interest in national security, but also it's an alliance of people, of research, of education, of soft power, of all of the international organizations that I remain supportive of in a multilateral setting. There is an inherent connection between all of these nations that I think needs to grow in time. And then I go back to this slide often, which is just remind us once again that in an Alaska-centric, but not exclusively, but okay, in an Alaska-centric, how important we are. But I try to convince folks elsewhere in our country, but as many of you know, I travel to other countries to try to put bookends, not just on NATO with Alaska, and then thinking about our colleagues in Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, but also about the North and the sweep of the North and all those things we have in common and how unique Alaska is, that we are a Pacific nation, an Atlantic nation, an Arctic nation, a Gulf nation, and really we sit at the nexus of domestic and U.S. foreign policy. So there are issues that radiate from the Arctic we should be mindful of, these arcs. There are issues that permeate to the Arctic, whether it's environment or geopolitics, that we should be mindful of. And I think Alaska has a unique role in influencing and informing our domestic and foreign policy, especially now, especially in a time of dramatic change. And I think, Simon, with that, that's the last of my slides. And I hope that some of this set the context for some Q&A or even just discussions among colleagues.
Great. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to try to turn off your screen share. There we go. While we get to some questions, we have quite a few in here that we'll get to. I'm going to start by reading one online, and then we'll bring Diane Hirschberg on to ask a question live. If anyone else wants to ask a question on camera, please just raise your hand or send us a message, and we will allow you to turn your camera on. First question here, with interconnected regions like the Bering and Baltic Seas becoming more strategically relevant, are there opportunities for joint US-Russia scientific initiatives that could simultaneously advance research and help reduce tensions, or is the geopolitical climate too constraining?
Yeah, it's as the former chair of the United States Arctic Research Commission, trust me, I've thought about this a great deal. And then obviously from the University of Alaska's perspective and how much work we have done with Russian colleagues over the decades, even through very difficult times of Cold War. This is one we all struggle with. Sadly, the situation right now prohibits the degree to which we've been able to cooperate with Russian colleagues. If the administration changes the posture of our current policy towards working in an international setting with Russia, I think that would have a ripple effect that would allow more cooperation between the two in the areas of scientific research. I don't know how this will evolve. There are some times when I think there might be an opening to resume critical research that has happened over decades. We've lost so many years of important data sets, whether it's on permafrost or cultural issues. You pick your issue. I mean, look, weather patterns. We need to know more about what's happening in the Russian north. It impacts us literally daily. Understanding better the thaw of Russian permafrost and what's happening there impacts us globally. The long-standing, decades-long research being done by researchers across the world in Russia and Russian experts doing work abroad, it just has enriched our understanding of the North. And so, I too am saddened by the reality of a country waging war on another country and the restrictions that has put on. So I don't have the answer, but I know that if our posture in terms of the ability for US and even Western researchers to work with Russian colleagues in Russia and vice versa, I think there would be celebration among the research community that is mourning the fact that we don't have that research connection. But you can't underscore how strongly the geopolitical environment, how much that weighs, the reality of it weighs on these kind of decisions. There's sometimes, and I see my friend Diana on the screen, there's sometimes that I watch the news and I think, okay, we might have an opening here for at least some kind of work that could be done. And then that door kind of closes. And so I've now stopped going with the wave and just waiting to see what happens, because look, research is important, but when you see what's happening in Ukraine, you certainly understand, we need to solve that before I think we're going to, sorry for the long answer, but I think that's what it deserves. I think we're going to have some sort of détente or some kind of agreement that thaws the relationship, no pun intended, where we can again engage at a level that at least resembles what we have done. I applaud my friends and colleagues in the Arctic Council that have found a way to cooperate among all 8 Arctic nations. It's not what it was before. It's not at the diplomatic level, but it is at the working group level, where you do have experts from all 8 nations working on absolutely critical issues for all of us, whether it's heavy oil issues, shipping issues, language issues. Those working groups are working. And I applaud my Norwegian colleagues for absolutely navigating that chairship that they ably handed over to the kingdom, so that work can continue. So yes, it's it is a backstep when it comes to US, Russia research and other countries' research there, but the Arctic Council has provided at least an opening so that when things are a little bit better, maybe that cooperation is advanced a little bit more. My Lord, where would we be without the Arctic Council and some other international organizations that are still able to do some work, like the IMO? We still work with Russians in the IMO. So sorry for the long answer, but I think it's a complicated issue. And if you push on one side of the issue, there are things that reverberate on the other side of it.
Thank you.
So, Mike, you set up my next question really well, and I apologize. You may just want to take the fifth. I'm actually going to ask two questions that are linked together. So the first is, do you think the Arctic Council can survive the combination of Russia's aggression in the Ukraine with now the US administration threats to Greenland and Denmark, but also to Canada? And the second tied in with that is you talked about some of the security threats with North Korea and such, but we have some colleagues, shared friends, who are now beginning in Canada and elsewhere to talk about the U.S. becoming a larger threat to them in the Arctic. So I'm just wondering, with your crystal ball and your magic hat, how do we get to the other side of this without losing what, as you rightly point out, is a phenomenal organization for peace and cooperation?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I will not plead the fifth. I will answer this as honestly and as best as I can, because when one Arctic person is talking to another Arctic person like you, we kind of have we've talked. So and I'm sure there's many colleagues online as well. Here's my take. I don't know that this is the right take. It's just Mike's take. I think, yes, the Arctic Council can and will survive this. I think that it's really dynamic, right? Because Greenland and the kingdom chairs the Arctic Council. Now, to some, that may be an Achilles heel. Look, this is not Pollyanna, but I'm being a realist. This might actually be okay. This actually might be an incredible time to have the kingdom chair the Arctic Council. It kind of puts a little bit maybe more focus on it. I think it can, because those working groups are working. I think it can because they thus far have been left to do their work, and there are measured narratives out there, at least in the Arctic Council world and among colleagues, not from administrations, that reinforce the idea of the Arctic Council and the work of the Arctic Council. I think, to be honest, it's going to be some time that we can repair all of the dynamics from our colleagues in the North that you get the phone calls, I get the phone calls, right? They are concerned, but they do know that there is politics and there is policy, and they know full well the differences. But I think it's up to forums like this, dialogues like this, to just reinstate what we consider to be norms, understanding there are political narratives out there. There are foreign policy narratives out there. What's our alternative? Is it to fold the tent? Absolutely not. Is it to continue on with the work? Yes. And so I think the Arctic Council does survive the invasion on Ukraine. I think it does survive these political narratives out there. I don't know what's going to unfold with Greenland. I have a very different take on how to get to an end game with Greenland that is of mutual benefit. And we know what those steps are. You can achieve a lot of the things the administration would like to do. I would recommend a different route toward the end game and goal, which would be a win-win for everybody. But I think it does. Now, look, you and I are going to be proven wrong or right or whatever, but I think it does. Second, you asked me, and then I forgot. What was the second one, or did I wrap those all into one?
Well, it was mostly how we respond to those same colleagues that I know are
Okay.
texting and calling you and me.
So I have responded probably like you, which is we all have these political narratives and administration policies and all of those things. So let's continue to work together. Let's continue to do the good work for the North. And by the way, just by evidence of what I've said, the rest of the globe, let's continue to do that. We understand fully that if a nation makes a statement, if a head of state makes a statement, it matters. It's a real thing. But it's up to people like us to work through those and just own the fact that we have a reality happening. But our commitment remains deep and abided, and we have shared We have a shared sense of urgency and purpose in the North. And that's what I would say and that's what I have said to my colleagues. Again, sorry for the long answer, but these are, it's like a nesting doll of issues we have to work through.
All right. And then next we are going to go to another live question from Doug. Doug, if you want to turn your camera on, you should be able to do that.
Oh, hey. Hi, Doug.
Great presentation. I had two questions for you. You actually answered the first one, which is how do we move ahead on first continuing research and promoting new research, which, as you say, is absolutely necessary. The question that I wanted you to address is the really easy one about how can we better engage local and indigenous communities in these policy issues? Because as I see what's going on, it doesn't appear that's happening. Instead, it seems to be at the very high level of government.
Yeah. Doug, it's great to see you. And thanks for these questions. You know what? Sitting in this chair at this institution, and then but also Cheryl in Anchorage, the chancellor in Anchorage, and Aparna, the chancellor in Juneau, just on an institutional level. All three of us, thinking ways in how do we not just respond to local indigenous communities and the work that we do as universities, but also how do we elevate these narratives to actually action. So I look at some of the programs that we all have going on in regard to the state of Alaska, which in some ways, and you know this better than I do, they look similar to programs in Canada and Greenland and Iceland, and I mean, keep going. And I think it's incumbent upon us to think about how we include our communities in our decision making. Sometimes we walk into communities, whether it's a university, a researcher, or a diplomat, we walk into communities and say, "Hey, we've got a hell of an idea for you," and maybe we do, but it's to me the proof is in the pudding and how we respond to the community needs. And so, research for research's sake, I'm all over it. Basic research, absolutely, but it's been heightened, at least with me, in the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years, that these communities are under so much pressure from very basic things like a gallon of milk. The subsistence patterns have changed so drastically. Isn't it incumbent upon institutions, as best we can with all of our financial constraints, isn't it incumbent upon us to try to figure out how best to not direct researchers to do their work, because that's not what the academy is about. That's not what research is about. But isn't it incumbent upon us to at least funnel the concerns of communities into the work that we do and try as best we can to respond in a meaningful way that might be able to leverage our current capacities to help them through whatever that is? And again, Merbach and Halan, I mean, these are devastating issues that have hit our communities. And I think we're not perfect. And boy, we got a long way to go in engaging with our indigenous and native communities and communities that are off the road system. But I think the sense of urgency in that area, at least like I've said in the last 5 or 6 years, not just for me, but for others, I think that has gone up dramatically. And I think there's an understanding, but also understanding we've got real financial constraints and sometimes political constraints, but we have to work through them. And again, like with our colleague Diane, what's the alternative? That's not an alternative for me. The alternative is how.
Well, and just to add that there are some models that have been developed and are being used. I'm thinking of Canada, of what's called braided research and two-eyed seeing.
Yep.
And so it's not. I don't think the issue is how do we think of how to do this, is how do we apply now? And I sure wish you had an answer for it, but I think it's overdue and it needs to be done. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Doug.
All right, and I'm actually going to combine two questions here from the Q&A. The first, how are Alaskans involved in negotiations with Denmark and Greenland? And then the other is, what's the most likely 80% outcome for Greenland?
Those are great questions. So let me pause for a second and think about what was the first one? How are Alaskans involved in that negotiation? Was that the first one?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know that Alaskans are. These negotiations are, if you read the news, the Secretary of State will be meeting next week with leaders of Greenland and the Kingdom to work out what the administration's perceptions and perspectives and wishes are, and it'll be up to the Kingdom and the people of Greenland to figure out what it is that they think is best for their nation. I don't know that Alaska has a role. They don't have a role. That's a foreign policy issue. Here's where I think Alaskans at least can inform the discussion, and that is that Greenland's fate should be with Greenland. Mike's opinion. The kingdom's future should be up to the kingdom. They are a NATO ally. They have been with us since day one in NATO. They have fought alongside of us. They have bled next to us. They have responded to 9/11 with us. They share ideology and democratic values. They are essential to the United States' national security. Absolutely. I think there's a different path towards the end game, and I'm happy to talk about that path. But I think Alaskans can reinforce the fact that we rely on the kingdom and we rely on Greenland as an Arctic nation to be cooperative and part of the international rules-based order, even though that's being challenged at the moment. I believe in it, and I believe it's worth discussing and doubling down on. And I believe that we need to reinforce as Alaskans that our friends and colleagues in Greenland we have one people between Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Same language, same culture, same music. I mean, there are bonds that go far beyond politics and far beyond security concerns, although politics and security concerns are absolutely priorities. But to demonstrate that we have common interests, common democratic values, common sense of the North, I think that's where we can be helpful. And to put into context Greenland's position, not just with the kingdom, but Greenland's position for the rest of North America, for our collective defense. But Greenland should decide what their future is along with the kingdom. I think that would be helpful to reinforce those democratic values. I forgot the second question.
I think that was it.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll go to another one here. Thank you. Question from Bill. With the Arctic Council constrained by current geopolitics, what alternative diplomatic or scientific channels does the U.S. view as most viable for maintaining stability and shared understanding in the region?
Well, that's a great question, Bill. Well, the Arctic Council certainly is one. I think there's a lot of value in, we have a number of international organizations. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum is one for our Coast Guards to cooperate together. There is research. I mean, the IASC and the research leadership of the International Arctic Science Committee is another one. In 2 months or so in Denmark, will be held the Arctic Science Summit Week, where research leaders from around the world who focus on the Arctic will come together. I think that is robust and needs to remain robust. Institution to institution around the North, universities like the ones in Alaska, working closely with Canada and Greenland and Norway and Sweden and others. I think those are other fora. The more the conferences and symposia have proven to be, they used to be a nice thing to go to, and they still are. You learn a lot, you meet a lot, you can forge real partnerships to do valuable work. I think they now have become even more important, whether it's Arctic Frontiers or Arctic Encounters in Anchorage or Arctic Circle. Those places afford us a place where we can, as Arctic citizens, come together in some forum to talk about whether it's policy or advanced research together. So I think there's a number of opportunities there that are some governmental, but mostly non-governmental, non-US, non-bilateral official bilateral relationships that we can take advantage of.
Great. And then I'll read one more question. If anyone else wants to go live, just raise your hand or send us a message. A question from Anita. To follow up on Greenland question, Greenland is a NATO ally composed most exclusively of native peoples who seek self-determination and sovereignty, which makes it vulnerable to Russian disinformation interference. As rule-based order being challenged, how does Alaska operate to help shape U.S. policy and respond to current administration?
Let me see where I want to my entry point on that. Very good question. I've thought about this idea of what's Alaska's role, and I think depending on your own beliefs, here are Mike's. Again, reinforcing. I double triple down on the international rules-based order. I think it's what for the last 80 years we have been key architects in keeping the world relatively safe. And we've not seen a third world war break out, but we have seen international organizations and multilateral organizations give some common frameworks for the way in which nations conduct themselves. I believe in borders. I believe that might doesn't make right. I think reinforcing those messages are helpful. The second one is I do believe in Greenland should determine their future within the kingdom's rules, within the kingdom's willingness. They are part of Denmark, but they have been given latitude that they have asked for, that they deserve as people, and they should decide whether or not they want to be independent or have a free association with another nation. And I think, as far as I can tell, Copenhagen has been interested in ensuring that Greenlanders have their voices. It's not perfect, just as it's not perfect in our own state or nation, to be honest. I think that stays there. Yes, they are a part of NATO. I think we need not to forget that. I can't imagine anything more devastating than to try to have a campaign against another NATO member, whether it's disinformation from Russia or disinformation from any other quarters of the world. There is disinformation going on all the time. It is detrimental. The fact is that the kingdom's going to have to figure out among themselves where Greenland goes. Greenland needs to determine their own path forward. I would still maintain that our job as a NATO ally, as a partner, is to let it be a kingdom issue. And I'll take this opportunity to offer, perhaps, if we have a few more minutes, I think, to offer, maybe this answers the question. I don't know. But there are certain routes that can take us to what I believe the administration's ultimate goal is, because this is kind of like the elephant in the room kind of issue. I believe the administration is right that Greenland is key to the kingdom's security. Greenland is key to NATO's security. Greenland is key to North American security, U.S. security. I believe in all of that. How we enhance our security, if that's the end game, and I think that's a good end game to have, at least when you're talking about security, I think we have every tool in our toolkit. Agreements already exists. Frameworks already exists. There's already an invitation and an appetite for the United States to increase our military presence there, and other nations' military presence there. I think at one point the United States had 15 bases in Greenland. We had hundreds or thousands of troops there. I know that our colleagues in the kingdom are not opposed to that. I think that if the long-term goal of this administration is to enhance our collective security, I agree with that. I agree that Greenland is key to that. I would just offer a different route. We know that the kingdom provides about $500 million a year to Greenland to help them each year. One route towards securing our own national security and defense and ensuring that Greenland is a part of what I would call the community of nations and free and determining their own future One way to do that would be perhaps investing 25, I'm making these numbers up, $50 million a year for 10 years. That's $500 million. That's about what the kingdom provides every year for Greenland. And part of that can be to enhance, which I think is needed, very much so, enhance our national security capacities there in Greenland, whether it's at our current base or maybe it's other assets that are built in cooperation with the kingdom and with Greenland. That's absolutely must happen with the communities anywhere near anything I'm talking about, but only a piece of that towards what our military may need. I don't know what those needs are, but we should ask our Pentagon, what do we need, along with our NATO colleagues. But equally important, and just allow me one more minute here, equally important would be to take an investment like that and also invest in civil infrastructure, civil society, help Greenland grow an economy that, yes, it could be critical on rare earths, but it also could be helping them expand their tourism, education, research. If you do that over the course of 10 years, ask our EU colleagues to do the same, I'm not sure you have to worry about Greenland or the kingdom thinking about investments or being coerced by other nations, because you are solidly being invested in, you're standing up capacity and capabilities, you're part of NATO, it is US presence. To me, that makes a lot of sense. It might be a quicker way to an end game, but also to really help the people of Greenland to determine their own future, but give them the tools to do so while importantly and fundamentally thinking about our own national security and North American security and NATO security.
Thank you. Really, thank you for that answer. We're going to go to one more live question from Logan here. And then
I'm Logan Boland.
Hi, Logan.
You kind of answered my question. I did a report during school about how 80% of Greenland's oil comes from Sweden. And if there's a Baltic Sea conflict, that would disrupt that supply. You kind of answered that would be, and I kind of suggested building NATO's search and rescue capabilities and, resilience. Like, how do you build that resilience out? So you kind of answered that. That's actually a really good roadmap for that. My question for you, I know you did your PhD in geography at UAF, focused on the Arctic. I'm actually applying there right now. That
wasn't a commercial, by the way. That wasn't a commercial at all. That I have my diploma over my shoulder. But go ahead.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering, as a rising expert in Arctic security, if you're doing your PhD in the same subject again right now,
yeah,
what would you do it in? What would you recommend someone like me go and do? Or what would you focus on? I'm more of a geospatial Arctic security guy, so if that gives you any ideas.
Yeah. Wow. I wish I could roll back the time. I'd look younger and there'd be a whole lot more to pick at. When I started that degree, I was the test rat. I was the first through that Northern Studies PhD, and I was trying to convince people that the Arctic was a thing and Northern Studies was a thing you should study. And I did my work. And it was simply to try to just get focus and just think about the Arctic in this context. Today, I think there's a number of different areas that I would want to pick on. I think this issue of the transatlantic alliance in a time of dramatic change, that would be a very interesting thing to me. I think the concept of a global Arctic and piecing together the pieces of what that looks like, because it's not just a bumper sticker, that would be interesting. I would want to know, I would kick tires on not just shipping, but economics. I would think about what's fascinating to me, and for a lot of reasons, is the issue of non-Arctic nations and their interests, assets, and capabilities in the North, and for what reason. Why are the BRICS interested in the North? Why does UAE show up to Arctic meetings now? Not bad, not nefarious, but those are interesting dynamics, because we're in a time of incredibly rapid change for the North. It's as if the world has discovered us and the Arctic. And so you can make the argument that it is unique and different. You could also make the argument is that it is a landscape that has now emerged, and for a lot on many landscapes, and now has impacts on economics, on security, on climate, on social issues and cultural issues You could also explore how Arctic nations have responded to the fact that the rest of the globe has either discovered us or we have now been embedded in almost every geopolitical foreign policy discussion you can have. I used to not joke, but joked about from Africa to the Arctic, I can tie them. Well, I think you can. You can tie Venezuela, you can tie North Korea, you can tie whatever to the Arctic. It'd be really interesting to see how the 7 Arctic nations, maybe the 8, have responded to the rest of the world looking north, but also acting north and including the Arctic in their domestic and foreign policies. Think about nations that are not Arctic nations that have Arctic policies. Why do they have them? What's in their policy? Is it about research? Is it about just being at the table? Is it because everybody else has one? Or is it because they understand the connection of the Hindu Kush to the Arctic and the Antarctic? Is there a tripolar context to this? Do not bypass the incredible dynamics that are happening in the Antarctic and what's happening there. It cannot be divorced with what's happening with the North and the Arctic, nor can you divorce that from what's happening in the Himalayas, whether it's water or geopolitics or energy or critical and rare earths, or the fact that we have rising powers, a risen power and a rising power, like China, who have global aspirations and are building naval fleets and other armadas. And so what does that look like? And there is a reason that you have Arctic, Antarctic, and Himalayan interests for a lot of different reasons. So I just gave you 14 PhD dissertations, but what's fascinating, I think most fascinating to me now that I've just thought out loud to all of you live, is I would look at the reaction of the rest of the world to what's happening because the rest of the world is now looking at the North. Why do they have Arctic policy? What are their motives? What are their assets? What are their long-term desires? Is it just to get a seat at the table, or do they really have unique, purposeful, clear domestic or foreign policy interests? To me, that would be one. A second tier would be the impact, the role of indigenous peoples in the North, right? 4 million people living above the Arctic Circle, but many, many people living in what we call the subarctic or the Arctic. And what role, what impacts, what about the native peoples who live in this region? What has been the impact? What have their voices been, or lack of voice in whatever domestic or foreign policy? Logan, I'm sorry I've given you 14 different PhD topics.
I'm sure he appreciates that.
Maybe.
Thank you again for joining us today and for everyone's continued engagement with the Alaska World Affairs Council. We hope to see you all online and in person soon. Thank you.